Well, ladies and gentlemen, we all thought Christmas was quiet. Yeah, it wasn't. Like, actually, a lot happened. But in unusual fashion, one of the things that I didn't actually see happen a lot was the usual racist incident that we see at this time of year. Seems like the media gets rather bored and then just manufactures some kind of racist incident that captures the mind of the public for January. But that hasn't happened. I suppose I should actually caveat that and say yet. But a lot else has happened because we've seen a lot occur in Africa and abroad. The big one is obviously US launched a direct missile attack in Nigeria. Now, if you recall, and you've been watching this channel, you'll know that America said they were going to do something in Nigeria if Nigeria didn't sort out the genocide problem that they had occurring against Christians. And apparently the government actually had a meeting with Trump and they agreed to some framework of some sort going forward. And maybe this is what they mean, or at least what they meant. But before we get on to the main video of today, can I yes again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like to support the work that I do here, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. So let's actually get to it. What happened? Well, on Christmas Day, Christmas Day, the US carried out precision airstrikes on Islamic State IS targets in northern Nigeria. Now, Trump publicly confirmed the strikes, describing them as powerful and deadly. You know how Trump talks. Now, Nigeria confirmed that the attacks were joint operations conducted at Nigeria's request. And that's important to understand. This was done at Nigeria's request. Now, US Africa Command said that multiple IS targets were killed. Now, these militants, as they described them, were all eliminated, but there has actually been no casualty breakdown. So we know that militants were killed. We don't know who else. Now, the strikes reportedly involved Tomahawk missiles launched by a US Navy destroyer. That missile had to travel some distance to get there, but, America. Now, the targets themselves were located in Sokoto State, which is not a traditionally jihadist stronghold. Now, local residents said that the blast itself actually shook the entire area, which they said had not recently seen militant activity. So there is a question as to why this specific area was targeted. Now, Trump framed the strikes as retaliation for killing of Christians, but this itself has sparked a backlash. Nigerian officials and analysts rejected the idea that the violence is primarily religious-based, so they say it's not killing of Christians by Muslims. They say that most victims and perpetrators are in the northwest and that they are Muslims. So to a degree, they suggest that the violence is Muslim also on Muslim. Now, analysts are warning that this framing of retaliation against Muslims for the killing of Christians risks turning criminal insurgency into a sectarian conflict because the armed groups in the region are fragmented. Some are linked to Islamic State, others are linked to Al-Qaeda networks, and many are simply criminal bandit groups, suggesting that these groups are actually all competing against each other and killing each other for more territory. Sounds a bit like Durban, I suppose. Now, there is growing concern that the US strikes could trigger retaliatory attacks across Africa. Mozambique, because Mozambique has a huge Islamic State, stronghold, and some other African states are all being flagged as vulnerable spillover zones, so they could all flare up as being conflict-rich areas, which obviously for South Africa would be detrimental because people may attempt to come to South Africa for refuge. Now, the EFF, you gotta love it. The EFF obviously had something to say about this, and that was that they condemned the strikes as US imperialism, despite Nigeria actually requesting the assistance with the strikes in the first place. In any case, he claimed that Africa is being dragged into foreign wars under the guise of counter-terrorism. Yet again, despite Nigeria having requested the assistance, with the EFF accusing the US of using Islamic State as a convenient excuse for resource extraction. And they warned Nigeria that it was surrendering its sovereignty by involving itself with America. Now, he repeated the usual familiar messaging, which all these Soviet-era-inspired left-wing stupid dumbass parties have to say. He says that the West exploits Africa. He says that religious framing is propaganda. and that military intervention never helps Africans. And this rhetoric matters because it mirrors how the South African government elite increasingly views the West. Well, this should be no surprise because, as we know, Islamist-inspired Durko is, well, very keen on left-wing propaganda. Now, all this at the time where South Africa thought to themselves they've got a great, huge brain fart of an idea, and that is that they are going to host Iranian naval vessels in Cape Town as part of a BRICS exercise. Now, this will be Iran's first participation in these drills, and the timing is explosive because Iran is under heavy international sanctions, which does risk to strain the US-South Africa relations further. All this at a time when Iran has just basically declared war against the West. And I mean a proper declaration of war against Europe and America. Now, defense analysts are warning serious counterintelligence risks because what we're effectively doing is sharing forms of exercise with partners that are specifically hostile to the West. Remember, Russia and now Iran. With the DA saying that it exposes South Africa's myth of being non-aligned because we're effectively hosting countries that are very much aligned. And they seem to be that we are aligning heavily with those parties. So whilst it's not expressly, there is clear signs of quiet alignment. Now, investors and allies see this as South Africa choosing sides, and to a degree that's because they are. Now, this is all very odd because this is all occurring at the same time that South Africa desperately wants foreign investment. Oracle, another company from the US that's looking to set up in South Africa, is now applying for an equity-free BE partnership deal. Now remember, this new equity equivalence, this deal process is being spearheaded by the delivery of Starlink into South Africa. Well, at least that's the thought. But remember, nothing's actually happened up until this point. But what this will do is it will allow BE compliance to occur without actually giving up ownership in the same way that it is for Starlink. Now, apparently, there are similar deals for companies like Dell, which have been done in South Africa before. So this process isn't entirely new, but it does highlight the contradiction. The South African government wants investment, and it keeps ideological barriers in place, be it CASA rules or the Starlink blockages that we already know of around ownership. Even with pro-investment ministers being constrained by this policy inertia, and the internal resistance to any forms of change. And we've seen that in the way that the ANC has campaigned directly against the new rules put forward by the communications minister, which would allow Starlink to set up without giving up its ownership. And investors are seeing this as a form of confusion because this entire process, this equity equivalence, is meant to help foreign investment into South Africa. Because South Africa is not aligned and it's a stable democracy, all while South Africa is quietly aligning with foreign nationals and the very left-wing parties in South Africa that should be helping international investment are directly blocking rule changes that could potentially allow foreign multinationals to come to South Africa and create businesses and enterprises that would employ individuals. It's all very schizophrenic. Now, it's because of their policy schizophrenia that what we are now seeing is that the ANC is bleeding support. Now, since the 2024 elections, according to the latest polls, the ANC has lost a further 63% of by-elections. Yeah, the ANC is not doing very well in by-elections since 2024. Remember the election that got them only 40% of the mandate? Well, now they're losing all their by-elections. Nobody trusts the ANC, with the DA and the PA gaining the most ground. The MK party is also steadily growing in some areas, with urban voters moving away from the ANC very, very fast. And that's because in many urban areas, they've actually seen what ANC decline looks like. Which does ultimately mean that the future for governance in South Africa is unfortunately coalition governments. But this is messy and in many instances very unstable. Even the DA has open warfare going on right now with accusations of fake investigations, public protector complaints, and leadership infighting. And this does create an image of national dysfunction, with none of the political parties that are taking over from the ANC really kind of being in a much stronger or better position than the ANC itself. But one of the things that we can firmly say is that the ANC's days are numbered. Now, moving on to a very final news story, and I've made my positions very clear on what I think of the Afrikaans refugee program to the US. But at the end of the day, every time I talk about this topic, I get loads of people unsubscribe and scream and shout at me endlessly. But in any case, in the latest news, an Afrikaner man who sought asylum in the US after arriving on a tourist visa has been detained for months instead of welcomed. Now, the reason for that is because the individual didn't actually know the process. He thought he could just fly to the US and then get there and claim that he was a refugee instead of going through the process in South Africa through the normal channels. But what this does do is that it highlights global uncertainty and the misinformation and fear around South Africans and the way that they are trying to go to the US in forms of desperation. Because one of the things that we can clearly see is that South Africans across all forms of racial and class lines are losing confidence in the country itself and are increasingly looking for exits, countries that they consider to be potentially an easier route for life, to give them an easier life ultimately. And what they are tending to do is watch geopolitics very closely in order to determine which country may be able to offer that. But I, for one, have made it very clear, I don't actually think any form of Western country at this point in time is actually the answer to South Africa's problems. But at least that's my opinion. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. And until next time, bye.